So how did we get to this point? Well, there are two trends going on here, basically. They're related and they sort of feed off of one another. The first is the rise in the use of SWAT teams. The other is just this sort of more general kind of military culture, I think, that is set in among both SWAT officers and non-SWAT officers in police departments. But they definitely feed off of each other and they're definitely related. Again, as Mayor Calvo said, there is a legitimate purpose for SWAT teams. I'm not opposed to SWAT teams in every situation, but when you have an already dangerous situation where someone presents an immediate threat to other people or to the community, that is the time to send in the SWAT team. Because what the SWAT team is doing then is they are using force to ameliorate an already dangerous situation. That is an appropriate use of the SWAT team. The problem is when you're using SWAT teams to enforce warrants, drug warrants, when you're using them on nonviolent crimes, you are creating a violent situation where there wasn't one before. And that's my problem with the way the vast majority of SWAT teams are used today. When you go after someone who hasn't harmed anyone else, who isn't a violent threat to anyone else, when you kick in someone's door in the middle of the night, you are creating confrontation, you're creating violence, you're creating a highly volatile situation that has a very, very low margin for error by the police or by the person on the other side of the door. And that is, I think, that is sort of the gist of my problem with the overuse of SWAT teams. The concept of SWAT team was first institutionalized by Daryl Gates, the former Los Angeles police chief, in the late 1960s. Gates had seen how a successful team of elite and well-trained police officers in Delano, California, had been successful in putting down the farm worker uprisings by Cesar Chavez. Gates had his own problems with the Watts riots and really wanted this team of police where you'd have like an officer who was trained in crowd control, you'd have one who was a sniper, you would have one who could, various other sort of specialized, various officers had different specialties, sort of like you would have in elite military units. Interestingly, at about the same time, we first sort of get this idea of the no-knock raid. And the story of the no-knock raid, I think, is particularly fascinating. The no-knock raid was not, the idea of the no-knock raid was not thought up by an accomplished criminologist who had been studying this stuff for 30 or 40 years. The concept wasn't come up with by a police chief. The concept, and this is a great book called Smoke and Mirrors by Dan Baum, that's sort of the history of the drug war up until about the mid-1990s. It's a little dated now, but it's a really good book. This is where this comes from. The concept was invented essentially by a 28-year-old political operative who worked on a Senate crime committee. And he had been sort of recruited by Richard Nixon to come up with a series of crime control policies that Nixon could run on that would appeal to suburban America, the silent majority, right? Well, at the time, Congress was more sort of aware of their constitutional limitations, so these policies would have only applied to Washington, D.C. This wasn't sort of a federal national crime policy. But the idea was to get suburban people thinking about all the crime going on in the inner cities and come up with some really get-tough solutions that we could pass to appeal to those voters. And one of them that this 28-year-old political operative was, wouldn't it be really cool if we let cops just sort of kick down doors of people who we thought were dealing drugs? And that really is where the whole concept of the no-knock raid comes from. And if you look at, actually, there was some interesting, if you look in the congressional record in the early 70s, there was some debate. There were crime bills that had the idea, put the no-knock raid in the crime bill that said that this needs to be a part of the police arsenal. And there's actually some fascinating debate at the time from some senators and congressmen who actually did sort of get it at the time, and the idea that having cops kick down doors for nonviolent crimes was a pretty ridiculous concept, a ridiculous idea. It wasn't until the early 80s, which we'll see here in a second, that the idea started gaining traction and was used much more frequently. That's not to say that no-knock raids were never used in the 70s, but the political debate around it was, I think, a much more sort of healthier position than it is now. So throughout the 70s, we started to see kind of an increase in SWAT teams. There are two really high-profile incidents, one with the Black Panthers and one with the Symbionese Liberation Army, with Gates' SWAT team in LA. Particularly the SLA confrontation was televised all over the country. It became kind of a pop culture moment. And in the 70s, we also saw SWAT really enter the pop culture. There was a SWAT TV show. The theme from it hit the top 40. And we really sort of saw the kind of this concept of these really kind of tough cops who could act like soldiers really kind of entered the mainstream. But even then, throughout the 70s, I mean, SWAT teams were largely used in these sort of highly confrontational situations, and they were really used appropriately, and they performed very, very well. It wasn't until the 80s and the Reagan administration, when they took a much more aggressive approach to the war on drugs, that we really saw SWAT begin to proliferate. There's a professor at the University of Eastern Kentucky named Peter Kraska, a criminologist who's been studying this basically since the early 80s. He's been sending out surveys to police departments across the country to find out how many times they deployed their SWAT teams. And what he's found is really astounding. In the 1970s, Kraska found that the total number of SWAT deployments in the U.S. was about 300 a year across the entire country. By the early 80s, about 82, 83, we're up to around 3,000 a year. So we've already seen a massive increase. As of 2005, Kraska estimates, and you can only estimate at this point because the police departments are less cooperative about giving him information, but he estimates we're around 50,000 per year now. So from a few hundred per year in the late 70s to about 50,000 per year now, which is really a remarkable number. I mean, that is 50,000 times per year. You have these sort of basically military units are breaking down the doors of U.S. citizens, and the vast majority are to enforce nonviolent crimes. As I mentioned, this Pentagon giveaway program really took root in the late 80s, and it really, I think, gave rise to the use of SWAT teams as these various police departments started acquiring all this military gear and then formed SWAT teams as a way to kind of put it to use. But some of the sort of more absurd examples of how these police, and there was really no rhyme or reason to how you got this equipment. It was basically who was able to best manipulate the system. So for example, landlocked Boone County, Indiana, my home state, which is completely landlocked, there's no body of water anywhere, has a armored amphibious personnel carrier that they got from the Pentagon. The police force in the town of Jasper, Florida, which has 2,000 people and hasn't had a murder in 14 years, was given military-grade machine guns from the Pentagon, which led one local paper to run the headline, 3 stoplights, 7 M16s.